The streets of London were silent. Not the silence of night or the hush of reverence, but the kind of silence that presses against your chest and steals your breath. The Queen's funeral was underway, a final march for the woman who had reigned for 70 years. And then, in front of the entire nation, one royal guard moved, broke rank. A ripple of shock spread. But what no one knew at that moment was this. That single step, that defiance of protocol, would reveal a story of quiet loyalty, human dignity, and a promise kept through the weight of grief. The skies were a muted gray over London that morning, as if the heavens themselves mourned with the crowds gathered for the Queen's final journey. Black coats and umbrellas dotted the roadsides, lining the ceremonial procession path like shadows of a kingdom in grief. The air was still. Even the pigeons stayed silent. In the midst of this profound stillness stood Lance Corporal William Evans, a picture of precision, dressed in the brilliant scarlet of the Queen's Guard, his rifle held steady, boots polished to a mirror shine. For 15 years, Evans had served in this role, stationed at Buckingham Palace, Windsor Castle, and during national events. He had been trained to stand for hours, never flinch, never fidget, never break formation. He was a guard, but more than that, he was a symbol of order, of honor, of tradition. And today, more than any other day, that tradition weighed heavily. This was no ordinary event. This was the state funeral of the Queen. As the royal procession approached in choreographed elegance, Evans kept his gaze straight ahead, yet trained his peripheral vision on the crowd. Behind the Queen's coffin, draped in the royal standard, the imperial crown resting atop it, walked her children and grandchildren, dignified and solemn. The ceremony had been timed to the second. Everything was perfect. But not far from his post, in the third row of spectators, Evans spotted someone who didn't belong, not because he wasn't welcome, but because he wasn't strong enough to push forward. Declan Shaw. Most people had never heard the name. But inside the palace, Shaw was a legend. For over 60 years, he had served as the Queen's personal footman. Not a servant in the traditional sense, but a steward of her routines, a quiet guardian of her world. He'd carried her tea, helped prepare her rooms, and witnessed countless moments in her private life. Shaw had been there for the birth of her children, the passing of prime ministers, and moments of national crisis. And yet, he had always remained in the background, part of the invisible machinery that kept the royal household running. Evans had first met him on a difficult summer day, early in his service. The guard had been standing at attention outside the Queen's apartments for hours. Shaw, passing by with a tray, had stopped just long enough to whisper, "Wiggle your toes in your boots, lad. Keeps the blood moving. No one'll notice." It had been an unexpected kindness in a world where silence and stoicism were everything. Over time, their paths crossed again and again. Brief nods in corridors, a word of advice, a shared smile. Two men of different generations and ranks bound by a quiet, mutual respect. Then, 2 years before the funeral, Evans had met Shaw at a royal garden party. The footman had been invited as a guest of honor after his retirement. He was thinner than Evans remembered, his hands trembling slightly as they stood beneath a blooming cherry tree. "The doctors say it's pancreatic," Shaw said without ceremony. "Not the good kind, if there is one." Evans had hesitated, unsure what to say. But Shaw wasn't looking for pity. "When the time comes, when it's her time," Shaw continued, "I want to be there. I need to be. But I fear I may not have the strength, if I can't manage the crowd. Would you help me say goodbye?" Evans had looked the old man in the eye. "I give you my word, Mr. Shaw." Now that moment had come. Evans watched as Shaw, frail and gray, struggled in the third row of the crowd, his thin frame jostled slightly by others around him. Despite the sea of mourners, Evans recognized him instantly. He looked smaller somehow, hunched, his expression tight with effort. He tried to shift sideways, to find a better view, but couldn't. His hand gripped a stranger's shoulder for balance, the other pressed subtly to his side, a sign Evans knew too well from their last meeting. The pain was back, and the Queen's coffin was approaching. Evans's heart pounded beneath his uniform. He was a soldier. He knew the rules. Knew them better than most. Breaking formation during a state funeral wasn't just frowned upon. It could end his career. 15 years of service gone with a single misstep. But duty was not always about following orders. Sometimes it was about remembering why you wore the uniform in the first place. He looked at Shaw again. This man who had given his entire life to serving the Queen, who had sacrificed family and comfort to be there for her every day. And Evans remembered his promise. In that moment, something shifted. He drew a deep breath. His boots turned on the pavement. A perfect about face. His first step away from his post was as smooth as any drill he'd ever performed. To the untrained eye, it might have looked like part of the ceremony. But to his fellow guards, it was an earthquake. Evans began walking. Lance Corporal Evans moved through the crowd with a grace that seemed almost choreographed. The scarlet of his uniform cut like a thread of honor through the sea of black coats and tear-streaked faces. The crowd instinctively parted, more out of reverence than confusion. No one spoke. No one stopped him. The sight of a Queen's Guard breaking rank was so unheard of, so shocking, that most could only watch, stunned. Evans kept his posture perfect, rifle at his side, shoulders square, eyes focused on his destination. The frail figure of an elderly man swaying on weakened legs near the back of the first barrier. Declan Shaw. To the public, he was a stranger. Just another old mourner in a sea of faces. But to those who knew the palace, his presence meant something. Shaw had been a living part of the royal household, an invisible fixture behind the crown. His job had never been glamorous, never public. He had never stood on balcony photos or attended state dinners. But he had served in ways that history rarely records, quietly, faithfully, through the ordinary and the extraordinary. Shaw had entered service in 1960. That meant he had served under 3 monarchs. But Queen Elizabeth had been his life's work. For over 6 decades, he had carried her luggage during royal tours, polished her shoes, arranged her day's letters, and prepared her room with precise attention to the smallest details. He never sought recognition. In fact, he avoided it. The greatest honor for a man like Shaw was to go unnoticed, because that meant the Queen's life had gone smoothly. And yet, here he was now, struggling to stay upright just to catch a final glimpse of the woman he had called my sovereign for most of his life. When Evans reached him, Shaw looked up, eyes glassy from age and emotion. "Lance Corporal Evans," he whispered, barely audible. Confusion flickered in his expression as the tall figure loomed before him. Not because he didn't recognize Evans, but because he couldn't quite believe what he was seeing. Evans didn't speak. He couldn't. Speaking while in uniform, especially during ceremony, would have compounded the breach. Instead, he extended his left arm, offering it with the same poise and reverence he might have shown to a visiting head of state. Shaw hesitated, out of habit, out of humility, but then allowed himself to be guided forward. Together, they walked toward the front. For a brief moment, the world seemed to stop. The Queen's Guard, designed to represent immovable tradition, was moving with purpose. Not for pomp, but for a promise. The spectators around them instinctively cleared a path. Some whispered, some wept, and some simply bowed their heads. Captain Croft, still in command, stood rigid at the far end of the ceremonial line. His face, known for its severe discipline, was now a storm of disbelief and fury. He didn't move, not yet. But everyone around him could feel the tension surge through the ranks. Evans positioned Shaw directly next to the empty spot he had vacated, a space that moments ago symbolized protocol, now transformed into something far more human. Shaw stood there, leaning gently against Evans's side as the Queen's coffin drew near. The silence was absolute. The gun carriage approached. The crown sparkled beneath the somber sky. And in that moment, Shaw lifted his trembling hand in one final salute, not a soldier's, but one born of deep respect, of decades of devotion. Evans stood beside him, eyes fixed forward, breathing measured. The ritual continued. The moment passed. But it had already carved itself into memory. Shaw lowered his hand slowly. "You kept your promise, lad," he murmured, just loud enough for Evans to hear. "She deserved your farewell, sir," Evans replied softly. Then, without ceremony or fuss, Evans gently helped Shaw back into the front row among the respectful onlookers. He didn't look for permission. He didn't wait for orders. With the same grace he had shown when stepping away, he returned to his post, rejoining the line as if nothing had happened. But everything had changed. His fellow guards, still frozen in their stance, didn't move or speak, but he could feel the shift. Respect, tension, and something deeper, something that couldn't be trained into a soldier. only earned through conviction. Captain Croft said nothing. Not yet. But his silence was thunderous. As the procession continued and the Queen's body made its final journey, no one in the crowd would forget what they had seen. Not a breach of discipline, but the embodiment of its truest form. A man in uniform keeping his word. A soldier honoring not just a monarch, but a human connection forged in loyalty. As Lance Corporal Evans resumed his position, the weight of his decision settled onto his shoulders like the cold steel of his rifle. The air still vibrated with the echo of funeral drums, but inside his chest, only one sound repeated. The quiet voice of an old man beneath a cherry tree saying, "When the time comes, would you help me say goodbye?" He had promised. It was 2 years earlier, on the grounds of the palace. A royal garden party was in full swing, filled with polished shoes, champagne flutes, and polite laughter echoing through the trimmed hedges. Evans had found himself alone for a moment under the cherry blossoms, where Declan Shaw stood, his thin hands clasped behind his back, gazing toward the palace windows as if they still held the memories of an entire life lived in service. When Evans greeted him, Shaw turned, his expression thoughtful. There was a tiredness in his voice that day, not of the body, but of someone slowly preparing to part from the world he had known for more than 60 years. "They say it's pancreatic, late stage. Not much they can do," Shaw had said plainly, with no trace of fear, only resignation. "I've served this family since I was a boy. The Queen, she's been my constant." Evans had listened in silence as Shaw shared stories no history book would ever record, of small kindnesses, midnight duties, and the woman who once asked after his ailing mother even during a global crisis. Then came the words that would stay with Evans long after the party had ended. "If I'm still here when the time comes, and I can't get close enough to pay my respects, would you help me, lad? Not as a footman to a guard, but as one servant to another?" That moment had marked something profound. Shaw hadn't asked out of desperation. He'd asked out of faith. Faith that Evans would do what was right, even if it cost him something. Now, as the Queen's coffin passed and Shaw stood where Evans had placed him, eyes glassy with reverence, Evans knew the cost. And he welcomed it. He had not acted out of impulse or defiance, but out of principle. In the ranks, discipline was measured by precision. But in that moment, Evans redefined it, not by standing still, but by stepping forward. The funeral continued as planned. The silence resumed. But the promise, once spoken beneath the falling petals of spring, had found its place in history, fulfilled not by words, but by action. And somewhere in the crowd, a man who had lived his life behind the scenes now stood front and center, thanks to a promise that had not been forgotten. Lance Corporal Evans had spent a decade and a half mastering the art of stillness, of becoming a statue draped in scarlet, embodying centuries of royal tradition. His job was not to move, not to react, not to feel. Yet in that moment, as he watched Shaw's body tremble in the third row and his frail hand clutch his ribs in quiet pain, every rule he had ever learned collided with something much deeper. Duty of the heart. He could have stayed in place. Let the moment pass. No one would have blamed him. No one but himself. His breath drew deeper, steadier. An internal countdown only he could feel. His eyes briefly flicked to Captain Croft, whose focus was fixed on the approaching procession. Croft was known for his unshakable adherence to protocol, the kind of officer who saw deviation as betrayal. If he noticed Evans' break formation, there would be no second chances. Evans turned his gaze back to Shaw. The man was struggling, visibly so now, trying to lift himself up on the barrier for a glimpse of the coffin. No one around him had noticed. To them, he was just another elderly man in the crowd. But to Evans, he was a man who had kept the Queen's world in motion for over 60 years, now nearly invisible in the moment that meant the most. The Queen's coffin was no more than 30 yards away. 20. The moment had arrived. With the precision of thousands of ceremonial drills, Evans shifted his weight and executed a perfect about-face, the kind he had performed in parades, inspections, and royal arrivals. Only this time, it was not part of the program. It was a choice. For a second, the motion was so seamless that it didn't draw attention. Then he stepped forward, breaking rank, breaking centuries-old ritual. Gasps didn't come immediately. The crowd, trained to observe with reverence, hesitated. But nearby guards stiffened. The line of scarlet that had stood like a living wall now bore a single, moving gap. One of their own had broken formation. Captain Croft turned sharply, his jaw tightening as he registered what was happening. His eyes locked on Evans with disbelief, then fury. But the young guard didn't waver. His stride was calm, measured, each footstep echoing louder in Evans's mind than it did on the pavement. He wasn't rushing, he wasn't hesitating, he was honoring a promise. As he reached Shaw, the crowd parted instinctively, perhaps sensing that something more important than protocol was happening. With steady hands, Evans guided the old man forward, helping him stand where no one else had thought to place him, right where he belonged. In doing so, Evans didn't just break formation, he redefined it. Sometimes the greatest discipline is not standing still, it's knowing exactly when to move. As the final notes of the funeral march echoed down the avenue and the Queen's coffin faded from view, Lance Corporal Evans returned to his post with the same poise he had left it. His back straight, his rifle steady, his face unreadable. To anyone who hadn't seen what happened, it was as if he'd never moved. But Captain Croft had seen, and he was already walking toward him. Croft's boots struck the pavement with precise fury. His expression was carved in stone, sharp, cold, and unmoving. When he reached Evans, he paused, his voice low but cutting. "Lance Corporal Evans," he said without ceremony. "You will report to headquarters immediately following the conclusion of today's ceremonial duties. Your attendance is required at a disciplinary hearing." Evans didn't flinch. "Yes, sir." He knew this was coming. He'd known it before he took his first step toward Shaw. And he accepted it, because in his heart, the right thing had been done. 3 hours later, after the final guard had been dismissed, and the last of the mourners had drifted away, Evans stood before the towering doors of the regimental headquarters. 2 senior guards flanked him as escorts. They offered no words. None were needed. Inside the conference room, the air was thick with formality. Colonel Richard Hargreaves sat at the head of the long table, flanked by Captain Croft and 2 other senior officers. The walls were lined with portraits of guards long past, men who had lived and died by the code of discipline and order. "At ease, Lance Corporal," the colonel said, his voice calm but firm. "I have received Captain Croft's preliminary report regarding your actions today. Before we proceed, I want to hear your account." Evans stood tall and spoke clearly. He told them about Shaw's decades of service, his declining health, and the promise made in the garden that spring afternoon. He recounted how Shaw feared being unable to bid farewell properly, how he had seen him struggling in the crowd, invisible to all but him. "I broke formation, sir," Evans concluded. "I accept full responsibility. I don't regret keeping my word to Mr. Shaw, but I will accept whatever consequences the regiment deems appropriate." Captain Croft leaned forward, his tone edged with restraint. "You abandoned your post during the most significant state ceremony of our time, for a personal favor. That is not only a breach, it's a disgrace to the uniform." The colonel raised a hand to silence him, then turned back to Evans. "You understand, Lance Corporal, that this breach could end your career?" "Yes, sir." There was silence, heavy, deliberate. Then Colonel Hargreaves nodded. "Wait outside while we deliberate." As Evans stepped out of the room, he exhaled slowly. He had no regrets, but he knew the price might be steep. Inside, behind closed doors, judgment was being prepared. Lance Corporal Evans stood alone in the corridor, the polished floor beneath him reflecting the quiet tension in his posture. He had faced military evaluations before, fitness reports, ceremonial reviews, but none had ever felt quite like this. In that room behind the heavy oak door, his fate was being debated by men who valued protocol above all else. And then the door opened. A junior officer stepped out and nodded. "You're to return." Evans entered the conference room once more, but something had changed. Seated beside Colonel Hargreaves was a new figure, a poised woman in a navy suit, her presence dignified but unmistakably commanding. Evans recognized her immediately. Lady Victoria Hamilton, private secretary to the royal household. Colonel Hargreaves rose. "Lance Corporal Evans," he said, gesturing to the seat across from him. "Please be seated. Lady Hamilton has brought important context to today's discussion." Evans sat, composed, yet visibly surprised. Lady Hamilton opened a folder before her and spoke gently but clearly. "Declan Shaw began his royal service in 1960. For over 6 decades, he was an unwavering presence in Her Majesty's daily life. His dedication earned him 4 royal commendations and personal recognition from the Queen herself." She paused, meeting Evans' gaze. 18 months ago, the Queen updated her funeral wishes. In those instructions, she named Mr. Shaw specifically, wishing for his presence at her private farewell at Windsor. Unfortunately, due to his declining health, he could not attend. However, she removed a sealed envelope and handed it to Colonel Hargreaves. This letter was written by a senior member of the royal family after today's events. It expresses appreciation for Lance Corporal Evans's actions, acknowledging his gesture as one Her Majesty herself would have valued. A stunned silence fell over the room. Colonel Hargreaves read the letter slowly. His features, usually steeled by decades of command, softened slightly. This letter urges us, not orders but urges, to consider the exceptional circumstances under which you acted, he said at last, lowering the note. Captain Croft shifted uncomfortably in his chair, the fight in his eyes dimmed by something unspoken. Hargreaves turned fully to Evans. The breach of protocol during a state funeral procession cannot be overlooked. However, the uniform you wear represents more than tradition. It represents compassion, service, and loyalty, the very values the monarchy stands for. He stepped forward and placed a second envelope on the table. You will forfeit 2 weeks' pay and undertake additional ceremonial duties for 1 month. This incident will be recorded in your file, but no further disciplinary action will be taken. Evans stood, his chest rising with a quiet breath. Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. And this, Hargreaves added, gesturing to the envelope, is a personal note of thanks from the royal household, addressed to both you and Mr. Shaw. For a long moment, no one moved. And then, for the first time since the funeral began, Evans allowed himself the smallest of smiles. His promise had cost him, but it had also honored something far greater. That afternoon, as the soft glow of sunset brushed the stone walls of London's royal quarter, Lance Corporal Evans made his way to a modest flat just a few blocks from the palace. There was no ceremony here. No guards, no gold trim, no lined-up crowds. Only quiet steps up an old staircase and a single knock on a familiar door. Declan Shaw answered, or rather the door opened to reveal the elderly man seated in a wheelchair, his once proud frame now clearly weakened. Yet his eyes still held that spark, that sharpness that came not from strength, but from memory and meaning. When Shaw saw Evans, his lips curled into a slow, tired smile. So, he murmured, what did they do to you? Evans chuckled softly, stepping into the room. 2 weeks' pay docked. A month of extra ceremonial duty. Nothing I didn't expect. Shaw raised an eyebrow. No flogging? Not this time, Evans replied, pulling a small envelope from his pocket. But they did ask me to deliver this. From the royal household. It's addressed to both of us. He handed it over, and Shaw opened the flap with shaking hands. Inside was a handwritten note, brief but powerful. A message of gratitude, of recognition, of quiet reverence for the gesture they had shared on a street lined with history and sorrow. Tears welled in Shaw's eyes, but he blinked them away. I didn't think I'd make it, he said after a pause. Didn't think I'd get to see her go. But I did. Because of you. Evans sat down across from him, the weight of that day finally settling into something gentle, something finished. You gave your life to her, he said. The least I could do was help you say goodbye. They didn't talk long after that. Sometimes words only get in the way of moments that are meant to be felt, not spoken. Before Evans left, Shaw lifted a hand, half wave, half salute. The same gesture he had used that morning as the Queen's coffin passed. It wasn't just a thank you, it was something far deeper. An understanding between two men from different worlds, bound by honor and a promise fulfilled. As Evans stepped back into the evening light, the city around him returned to its rhythm. Cars moved, bells chimed, the day pressed on. But somewhere, deep in the heart of London, history had quietly shifted. Not with loud speeches or grand gestures, but with one small moment of kindness. A single step forward when standing still would have been easier. In a time of loss, it had been a moment of dignity, and for Evans, and for Shaw, it had been more than enough.